Lovely to have you all here on day one of this afternoon. I remember last year in the soil tent was one of the white rectangular marquees, and it was scorching hot. I don't know if any of you came to that session, but it was hot. Yeah. And I did say to Alex Cherry, I was like, oh, next time I really want to be in one of those open-sided marquees where some breezes come through, and he clearly has. But of course, and I joked and I said, "You watch, next year it'll be bucketing down with rain, and it'll be really cold, and we probably will want to. We want the walls on the side. We want to all cozy up." So there you go. Anyway, I'm glad it's not as hot as it's been the last few days. Hey, I think this slightly cool weather is perfect. So I hope you've all been enjoying your session, your morning, I should say, so far. And yeah, I haven't really had a chance to check out anything, I'll be honest. I've been running around here or there and getting ready, and so I'm looking forward to some of the sessions later this evening and tomorrow. So we have a bit of a double session here. I'll be starting off with a presentation. As you can see on here, we're going to do a bit of a discussion around agroecology, regenerative agriculture, kind of dissecting these two schools of thought and where they kind of overlap and where they also diverge. And we'll kind of link that into a bit of discussion about paradigm transitions. How do we help to support the transition towards an alternative agricultural model? So that'll be the session for now, and then we'll be coming back with a little bit later with a second session with covering some of the practical considerations about peer-to-peer learning, farmers helping farmers, and explore a bit of a case study from Australia. So that'll be the second one. Now, for some of you farmer folks here, this will not be one of my usual type presentations where I put a lot of science up and we try to kind of turn that into practical information and actionable field-based strategies. This talk is going to be a little more philosophical about these two schools of thought and how they might learn from each other. So it's not going to be quite so applied and practical for some of the farmers in the room, but for some of you others who may be here for a bit of general interest, hopefully there'll be something there for you. Okay, so we're going to talk for about an hour or so, and depending if I stay on time or not, and then we'll have some discussions or some questions, and then we're going to take a little break before, about a half an hour or so break before the next session. Okay, so before we start, I've got quite a few slides that I will be reading off the screen, so I had to set this up here so I can just see things because I can't see the screens. So hopefully you can. Okay, so just to start this conversation, as I say, it's going to be a bit of a perspective. It's going to be a bit of a merging still of reviewing some of the literature. We'll kind of cover some of the literature review, and I'm going to merge that with my own perspectives and my own kind of personal views on this. And I say that because regenerative agriculture is a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's really, this is part of its excitement, but also challenge, is that it hasn't fully and really been pinned down yet. And that presents some unique challenges, but it also presents some unique opportunities in terms of that openness about it and how therefore not quite so fixed yet, and therefore it can be a little bit more open and a bit more inclusive. So I think you're all going to have different views on this, and that's great. So that's what we're going to engage in the discussion at the end. We can kind of bounce around some of that discussion, but I'm just going to kind of bring my personal slant into it. So I encourage further discussion, encourage further thinking, to think about those differences and how that can also be a strength. I'm going to also provide a bit of critical analysis, critical discussion points on both regenerative and agroecology. And I would just like to stress that I provide that criticism not because I am not a fan of either of these two things, but as a sign of my support for these two things, that we must embrace all aspects of these two schools of thought, these two paradigms. Both have a lot of strengths, maybe some weaknesses, and it's important that we uncover both of those, that we proceed with our eyes wide open in terms of how to support this transition of agriculture. Okay, so we're going to do definitions. We're going to try and define these two, talk about the history, where they align, where they differ. We'll bring that into some discussion about transitioning and wrap it up with a bit of a conclusion. So let's head into this fun old topic of definitions. Now, the definition of agroecology is a lot easier one to start with than the regenerative one. So agroecology generally, again, there's actually a lot of different definitions of agroecology out there, but probably the nicest kind of streamlined one that's very commonly used is this idea of agroecology is a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. Now, underneath that, what does that really mean? So as a science, agroecology could also be referred to the study of ecology and ecological principles and how we might apply that into an agricultural setting. So it's very much a science about ecology and agricultural ecology, agroecosystems, how ecological processes unravel and how they behave in an agricultural context. So that's the kind of the sciencey part of it. But it is also a set of practices. So we could also talk about agroecology as a way of growing. So therefore, underneath that comes sets of practices that we, again, field-based practices, field-level practices that we could implement in order to grow in an agroecological way. And, you know, part of that, again, is this kind of merging of ecology and agriculture. How can we bring ecological elements into the farm landscapes? Wildflower strips, beetle banks, some of these types of things. So how do we farm in a way that is like the landscape, like ecology? And then we have this third layer, which is the social movement and, aspect. And here we're trying to kind of broaden the discussion about agriculture into these other aspects like food sovereignty, the right to food, food security, marginalized food producers, some of the various cultures, and social aspects that come with that, and also incorporating some indigenous knowledge and traditions. So we have this third layer to this, which all three of these are actually quite different, and really what agroecology tries to do is bring them all together under one kind of big roof, under one big umbrella. So here we have, again, just a visual example of this. On one hand, it's a scientific discipline where we could talk about ecology at the plot level or at the field level. We could talk about ecology at landscape levels and how landscape processes can also influence our farms or our growing spaces. And beyond that, agroecology then also will move into the ecology of food systems. So that's one of its real strengths, agroecology, that it goes beyond just field level, farm level. It also addresses the food system. How do we also think about transition through all of the rest of the value-added chain, through processing, through distribution, through retail, leveraging all of those other big pieces of the food system that are also have a big impact in what happens down below at the field level. So again, it's a very, very comprehensive across the food system, not just farm and field-based. The movement there, the social aspects, the social movement there, you've got things like environmentalism, rural development, land access, some of those other aspects, and how do we be sustainable at that field level? And then, you know, the techniques or the agricultural practices that then drive some of that. So broadly, we could say there's this often quoted dimension to agroecology, which is the 10 elements. And you can see there's many aspects here. We're not actually really going to go, I'm not going to go deep into all of these. I'm just really trying to point out that there's a lot there that goes beyond the farm system into all of those other aspects of the food system, as I mentioned, but also there we're bringing in some of the aspects of governance and that kind of thing, but also some of the social, the cultural aspects, the food traditions, some of the thinking around circular economies and that kind of thing as well. And that's, I won't go through all of these, but just in a nutshell, things like efficiency, recycling, resilience in the middle there, you know, that's very relevant to how we produce that, again, that farm level aspects, but moving on to things like the human and social values, the culture, these are going much more beyond just a field-based technique. It's us as the people, as society, how we do agriculture. The culture part of agriculture is what we're trying to kind of weave in. And because agroecology really addresses and goes much more up into the food system, it is a lot more comprehensive in its approach. And so it has a lot of these elements of, okay, those aspects to which we are trying to address or change, and then certain principles that may come from that. And again, you can see more of the top half, the top kind of circle on the principles here. We've got various things that are related to the field level: biodiversity, animal health, soil health, of course, bringing in some of the economic aspects there, through to some of on the bottom circle here, where we're talking about our society, our culture, how connected are we, how participating are we in food systems, diet, land governance, land access, some of these other socio-cultural dimensions. Okay, so again, just trying to kind of paint this picture that it is because, as we're going to move on and talk about the history of agroecology, because it's been around for a lot longer than regenerative, it has had more time to evolve and to start thinking about layers of transition in terms of through that entire food system and how we might address and support that transition. So I guess you can see there already that there's a lot to agroecology. It might have that simple definition of, a science, a practice, and a social movement, but because of that also there's many, many layers underneath this, and it does get therefore a little murky and muddy because of that very comprehensive nature to it. There's many, many layers there. And of course, regenerative, on the other hand, is really quite a simple idea, and that's really part of its strength, I think, is a real asset to this school of thought. And on a basic level, we could kind of start this conversation of saying, well, what's regenerative? Well, it means we are regenerating, we are restoring, we are repairing the resource, whatever that might be. It might be soil health, it might be ecosystem, it might be landscape. So it's this idea that, are we just sustaining, therefore leaving the environment as it is, just sustaining a broken resource? This is this kind of narrative that we hear a lot with regenerative. Or are we actually going to repair and restore? And in the context that, as we know, that we have degraded many of our landscapes, we do have issues with soil quality, with water quality, etc. So we know that through intensification of agriculture over the last 70 odd years, of course, many of our resources have been declining. So it's not adequate anymore to just sustain those, that we actually need to repair, we need to regenerate. And okay, once we do that, sure, then sustainable should be a part of. I know sustainable is very out of fashion now. We're all talking about regenerative, but what happens after we regenerate? Now, I think there's an element there that we still need to keep sustainability in our lexicon, in our discussion. It's still an important piece of thinking that I think should still also be part of the discussion. But anyway, breaking it down just very simply to start with, it's kind of this idea of sustaining something or actually improving something. Now, beyond that simplistic idea, let's get a little bit deeper into some of the discussions, some of the definitions, I should say. Let's start with Groundswell's definition. Let's hear what they think about regenerative agriculture. It's quite simple. I like that opening statement. It's quite simple. It is any form of farming, the production of food or fiber, which at the same time improves the environment. This primarily means regenerating the soil. It's a direction of travel, not an absolute. Okay, there's a nice definition, nice and simple. Again, this idea of regenerating, improving. Here's another definition from Charles Massey. Some of you would know his book, Call of the Reed Warbler. He brings a similar aspect to this, but let's kind of explore this one. It implies more than just sustaining something, but rather an active rebuilding or regeneration of existing systems towards full health. It also implies an open-ended process of ongoing improvement and positive transformation. So, okay, there we have this point that actually maybe you do not reach this level of sustainability, that maybe it should be a virtuous cycle of continual improvement. So there's two definitions, but of course we have many of us are engaging in regenerative these days. Many actors are involved in this discussion. So we also have definitions of regenerative coming, for example, from the corporate world. So here we have one from McCain's UK here. So here we have the definition as regenerative agriculture as an ecosystem-based approach to farming that aims to improve farm resilience, crop yield and quality by improving soil health, improving water quality, optimizing water use, enhancing biodiversity, and reducing the impact of synthetic inputs. Okay, so again, we have a very outcomes focused there. It's not so much about the practices, the tools in which we use, although they've slipped one in there, reducing the impact of synthetic inputs. We've got a little bit of a practical aspect to that definition. And another one here from Syngenta, for example, regenerative agriculture is an outcomes-based food production system that nurtures and restores soil health, protects climate and water resources and biodiversity, and enhances farms' productivity and profitability. Okay, so there we have this very outcomes definition. It's not about how we do it, it's about what the end goal is. And again, this definition is bringing in an element of economic sustainability, economic profitability as well. Another important aspect to this regenerative discussion. Okay, so there's a selection of definitions, and you can see there's an element of similarity between them all with a couple of maybe slight differences. But we can also think about regenerative agriculture in its field-based level, the practice, the farm-based, the practice base. And you enter things like the principles, the regenerative soil health principles or regenerative agriculture principles. And of course, these are more practice-based. So these are farm-level instructions. Let's minimize soil disturbance. Let's keep that soil covered with armor, mulch, residues. Let's grow living roots, green cover as much as we can. Can we integrate as much biodiversity and livestock back into the system? So this is this important, it's all great to talk about outcomes. Oh, we want to improve the natural resource base. Of course, we want to improve quality, but how do we do it? How are we going to get there? And that's where some of these field level practical aspects are also very important. And just as a small example, look at this, the beautiful simplicity of this image here. I think why has regenerative principles captured the imagination of so many farmers and growers all around the world? I think it's the beauty of it is its simplicity. Follow these general guidelines and you'll provide an umbrella macro level view of apply these principles in your contexts. And of course, the contexts are going to be different here and North America or Australia or anywhere else. There's always different contexts. But okay, if we generally apply these principles relevant to your context, we can improve and support the change and the transition, improve the outcome, improve the resource base. So my point here is just that these umbrella macro level guidelines are really quite simple. And I think that's really part of their success, particularly if we think about that image again, where, okay, yeah, so many more layers to agroecology. It does get a little muddy and more complex. It's a bit blurry about what it is, and that's not necessarily a total critique. It's just the nature of what agroecology really tries to do, which is going beyond the farm gate, going all the way multi-level up into that food system. Of course, food systems are incredibly complex, and if I think we're going to address and change those, it is not going to be maybe so straightforward and simple. So we have practices, but then we also have those outcomes. And generally, what would be the outcomes of regenerative agriculture that seem to be very tightly coupled with this word? It's things like improving soil carbon, soil health. I think these would be very tightly linked with regenerative thinking. We also have, of course, water quality. That came up in a few of those definitions. Biodiversity down the bottom there, but also the economics. So a little bit of the economic sustainability, regenerating the financial aspects to farm businesses, which are operating, generally speaking, in incredibly low and thin profit margins. It's becoming more and more difficult to make a living out of farming with such tight margins these days. So we also need to bring in this economic aspects into the discussion as well. And that is then profitability. And that's obviously that very important part. So this is a very small image. You may not be able to read it all entirely, but you can catch up on this one online. This is just a nice table here from a review paper looking at these different definitions of regenerative agriculture, really trying to break them up into those practices, the field level strategies versus some of those outcomes. What are we trying to regenerate? What are the ecosystem properties that we're trying to repair? And they're really doing an analysis here of comparing which of these or how these are used in academic literature versus practitioner literature. So generally through grey literature on websites, these types of things, and how these might differ. And there are a couple of things here that I just want to flag and point out that there is a nice similarity. I'll do a little zoom in here so we can see some of these. So, for example, tillage, you can see this rates very highly. Of the literature, in academic literature versus practitioner, like how many of them quote reducing tillage? How many of them quote some of these principles that we talk about? So you can see amongst the practitioner, going no-till, reducing disturbance, that rates very highly, as does using things like cover crops or crop rotations. They're rated also relatively highly there. Integrating livestock, you can see this one creeps up a little higher here. Quite a lot of them on the practitioners, creeping up a bit in the academic literature, so bringing livestock, mixed farming systems back into the discussion. And here's this one here that seems to be quite common in both, reducing inputs, reducing the use of those external inputs. So both are quite highly rated. A high percentage of articles talk about this discussion point on reducing inputs. So they align or overlap there. Over here on the outcomes, this is where we're talking about some of those improving properties. We can see again some interesting differences. Okay, improve ecosystem health. Okay, again, this is our practitioner on the right, journal academic on the left. So we have ecosystem services, quite highly rated here. But look at these couple here, increasing biodiversity, definitely synonymous with regenerative. Increasing water health, definitely, especially in this country, in issues like around Europe with nitrate, leaching, etc. And here's this one here, improving soil health. And again, that's probably the biggest one I think that we do have to acknowledge with regenerative. It has put this real focus on soil health, bringing everything back to soil health and the importance of that as a foundation for all of our farming or production systems. And you can see they both rate very highly here. So 86% of practitioner websites mention the importance of soil health, and equally a lot of the journals do as well. So that really, this point about soil health does really seem to stand out as a particular focal point around regenerative. And here's another one here, nutrient density, food quality, bringing in a little bit of that link to the cultural, the social, the importance of the quality of the food that we eat for our societies. So okay, so there's just a little analysis highlighting that there are these differences that occur, some similarities, but there are these differences with how we all talk about regenerative agriculture amongst ourselves versus how it's also phrased in the academic literature. And I think linking all of these definitions of regen into the discussion, I see this slight similarity emerging between agroecology and regen in that there are different layers of the definitions or layers of the thinking. So, for example, we could say there's a philosophical element to regenerative agriculture. How is it that we do agriculture? What are the things we're trying to change? What are some of the outcomes that we're trying to improve? So how do we go about that? How do we go about the change, the improvements that we're seeking? And again, that's a little different, say, from those field-based regenerative agriculture, where that's talking about those practices, the strategies we implement in order to reach the philosophical outcomes. But I think we also then have this, as I was alluding to there in those different definitions, these maybe what could be called an institutional concept of regenerative agriculture, where how industry uses the term, how NGOs may use the term, how corporates may use the term. And so, everyone, of course, has a slightly different agenda. And so we can craft the definition of regenerative because it is still a bit open-ended and loose and not quite so fixed, that we can steer that definition towards different goals, towards different agendas, so to speak. So I see to some level there is this kind of also, even within Regen, there is this slight divergence of kind of thinking on what it is and how, etc. So let's go a little bit into the history of these two. I'm mostly going to outline history on agroecology because it's much longer, and we'll briefly say a quick thing about the history of regenerative. But before we go there, I think it's also very important to acknowledge the fact that the reality that many of the ideas that we talk about in agroecology, in regenerative agriculture, are ideas that have already existed, that predate these terms, that already existed in indigenous cultures around the world. And, here's some visual examples of this. You can see the three sisters there. I mean, this predates the idea of diversity, of companion cropping, of intercropping. Before we kind of coined those terms and talk about that in a Western context, this was already existing prior. And this is this idea of growing, pumpkins, legumes, and corn altogether in this kind of companion intercropping scenario. On the left, you have a tuberous kind of semi-aquatic root vegetable. This is kind of more of a North American context here. This is called these Wapato beds. And these were cultivated. These were agricultural lands by the indigenous, which to a Western eye, first colonial kind of eyes arriving in North America, didn't recognize this as agriculture. Our definition of agriculture was cultivating the soil, planting seeds, growing in that sense. Our European definition of agriculture, we didn't see it because we didn't have necessarily those two eyes seeing, so to speak. So that's an example, a really nice example of a perennial agriculture that was also being used by the indigenous there. And over on the bottom right-hand side, we also have in Australia, some of you might be familiar with this book, Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. It's a very interesting book where he also outlines some of the agricultural practices that we have evidence for that were existing in Australia prior to colonization, so that they were not Indigenous Australians were not necessarily completely nomadic. They did have aquaculture. They were saving seed from grass, grinding that, making something akin to a bread. These are things that happened well before our Western framing of some of these ideas. So I put that up there just to acknowledge that. But okay, we will move on and talk about it in maybe this more modern contemporary context. So I mentioned those three definitions of agroecology for a reason, because they sit across a timeline. So if we think about when we first see this term, agroecology, it was around about the 1920s or 30s, where it was thought more about a science. It was about understanding ecological principles and bringing them into an agricultural growing system, how we could learn from nature and apply that into our growing systems, our growing practices. So that's really, it has that definition. The science part of agroecology starts first. And then we have the emergence of the next round, and that was really around the 70s, 80s there, around that Green Revolution stage, whereby there was concerns about seed control, breeding, pesticides, fertilizers, concerns around the negative effects of some of these on the environment, and therefore we developed the practice base of agroecology. How do we grow in a more organic way? How do we grow field level practices in a more natural way? So that then kind of emerges around that 70s, 80s timeline, the second part of that definition. And then in more modern times, we have the aspects of the social movement, and that's really around the 1990s, where it becomes addressing more of the greater food system aspects, social, political, economic aspects to agriculture, trying to again address things like rural decline, loss of that indigenous knowledge, corporate control of land, food access rights, food sovereignty, these types of things. So you have these three actually quite different definitions to agroecology, but they all came up in different timelines. But over time, they have merged to be this very comprehensive school of thought. I think it's a real strength, a real asset of agroecology, that through time we have layers that were put on top of it. New knowledge, different angles, different perspectives, that was not rejected to be something different, to become something different, that was assimilated, was integrated. So we are bringing these together into a more comprehensive definition, and therefore arguably greater ability to address transition because of that more comprehensive nature of it. So there's a timeline involved there, and I think pointing out here we have 1920s through to today. This is a long time. Agroecology has been going for a long time, and it has been through these iterations and evolutions during that time. And I emphasize that point because regenerative agriculture, therefore, we could argue, is still quite new. It is still quite young. It was really around the 1979, 1980s where this term was first coined. So I was reading into this. Medard Gable is a social scientist. He seemed to coin that word in 1979, but usually you'll read that it was Rodale around 1980, who's more generally associated with founding this term regenerative agriculture. And at that time, anyway, it was more of an organic, linked in with the organic philosophy, organic growing techniques, which of course Rodale are famous for. So it has its roots in a little bit more of the organic world and organic production. and emerged around the 80s. But it actually went quite dormant after that. It's been actually quite dormant until the last 15 odd years, 15, say 20 years, where regenerative has now become what it has become. So it has a bit of history. It went dormant, and now it has got massive traction behind it, as you're all very aware. And we're all here today. This event is here today to kind of explore that and talk about that. And I emphasize this point about the timeline here is because we do have this debate about defining regenerative agriculture. Every conference that you go, we've seen it here, I've seen it in many others all around the world, there's always a panel session, there's always a discussion on defining regenerative agriculture. We have this topic in every single event around the world. I've seen it time and time again. And we all thrash out these different discussions and definitions. And that's all good, again, because it's nice to get multi-perspectives, many layers to that. But I'm just pointing out the timeline that agroecology has undergone and how it has changed over time and evolved. And we seem to be in such a rush to define regenerative agriculture, to pin that down, to box it in, to lock it down. Which I personally, if I think to this example, this timeline of agroecology that has been going for so much longer and so many more layers got added to it, that I feel we should not, personally, that we should not rush into this defining regen thing. We've got decades more of time to understand this, to unpack this, to learn, to apply it, to learn from the field-based applying applications and assimilate all of this knowledge into, if we want, a more formalized definition. Now, I know there are negatives and challenges with not defining it either. That means everyone can be regenerative, from all layers of small hobby farmers through to large corporate farms. It's, again, how we interpret that, how we define that, in which, therefore, we can call ourselves regenerative. So, of course, that's a real challenge on two massively different ends of the spectrum. Somehow everyone comes under this banner. And some see that as a real negative thing. You could also see that as a positive thing. It's very much bringing us together instead of that kind of us and them mentality. So there's strengths and negatives to kind of unpack there. So anyway, for me, I personally think we shouldn't be rushing into certifying and standards around regenerative. Just my personal view. I think it's still quite an early philosophy, an early school of thought. I think it has a lot of time still and evolution to maybe evolve and crystallize and form whatever it will become. That's just my personal view there. So let's quickly unpack where these things align and differ. So starting with convergence. Agroecology and regenerative agriculture definitely very strongly align to things around ecology and agronomy. How do we grow? How do we produce? How do we farm? And how do we do that in a way that supports ecology, take care of those resources, regenerate the land base? These two things are strongly the same, I would say, in both these two schools of thought. So again, soil ecosystem restoration, using biological processes, ecosystem services, funneling them in towards growing, minimizing the use of those external inputs, integrating animals, etc., to plants and animals, using photosynthesis as a tool for both annual and perennials, bringing carbon into the soil for that soil restoration. So using plants, combination of plants, diversity of plants. So all of these aspects, I think, to the practical side of growing, I think are very much in alignment of these two kind of schools of thought. And I think that agroecology just has a slight advantage there, being that it is a lot more interdisciplinary. Because it is, again, maybe older and more matured and has many more layers to it, it is overlapping a lot more with a whole range of different agricultural aspects or production systems. It's not just trying to merge kind of multiple things together. It's really looking at the crossover and how these points can be leveraged or harnessed towards improving the system. So I think certainly agroecology, because of that more holistic, interdisciplinary view, has a lot of kind of real strengths and benefits to bring to that conversation. And I think it's just, it's very interesting times what we're seeing these days in the agricultural and the farming world. if we go back not so long ago, there was a bit of a divide between organic and conventional. It was kind of, again, us and them. That's the organic guys. We're the conventional guys. And, never the two shall meet. And it's very clear in the last 5 years and the last 10 years, I mean, that barrier has massively been broken down. You can go to a field day today on soil health, and it's a total mix of farmers in the room, and they might be completely a mix of both organic and conventional, but they're asking the same types of questions. They're all interested. How do I improve my soil health? How do I improve my plant health? How do I use less inputs? How do I improve soil structure? How do I be more efficient? Actually, how do I increase earthworms? Whatever it might be. The types of questions that organic and conventional farmers ask these days are really one in the same. And I think that's definitely a real strength and positive thing that has come out of the soil health and regenerative movements, that it really has broken down that traditional barrier, and we've found this common ground in the middle ground here. I think this is a very, very important and positive thing that has changed in the last few years. So I think there's just a lot of interesting space happening in the middle. That old kind of discussion about us and them, left or right, actually is quite boring. Like, the real fun and exciting stuff is all the things that are happening in the middle, and whatever we want to call them. There's, again, all sorts of terms, buzzwords, words that come and go, that become fashionable or not, but nonetheless, it's all of that stuff that's happening in the middle. And for me, I personally think that soil health, particularly soil biology, that aspect of soil health, has been a really central driver of that. It is unpacking this complex world of the life in the soil that has really been a key spark, I think, a key interest amongst farmers and growers. This fascinating world of the soil biome, how vast and complex it is, and how little we know about it, and therefore how much potential there is for it to help us redesigning our farming systems towards something more sustainable, towards something more regenerative. I do think soil biology, and again, that tightly coupled with soil health, has been a really key driver of some of this breakdown in the middle. So I think, again, there's, I think, exciting times ahead as we kind of explore all of that texture in the middle and navigate kind of what all of those things kind of mean moving forward. Now, just a final point here on convergence, I would just say that we are beginning to see regenerative embrace a little bit more of some of the food system thinking, some of the social aspects to farming, and we're beginning to see how regenerative is potentially drawing inspiration there from agroecology. One small example here would be Rodale's certification scheme. They were first off the block in terms of creating a certified standard for regenerative, and theirs was an organic standard, so it was certified organic regenerative. And yes, it's about soil health, animal welfare, etc. But this was kind of, I think, from my view anyway, the first time I seen this in the regenerative movement. They specifically include some standards around farmer and worker fairness, looking at working conditions and some of the economics aspects to the social side of the farming. So I think this is one small example where we are beginning to see regenerative nudge a little bit towards some of the agroecological thinking. Okay, but where do they differ? Where do they diverge? And the big one is this point that I was making. Classically speaking, it's this social, political aspects, that social movement arm that is very predominant in agroecology, but is still very little, I would say, or minimally being discussed in the world of regenerative. I think this is by far the biggest difference between the two, is agroecology's embracing of the social aspects that come from all of these types of institutions. For example, on the list, I won't go through all of these, but just pointing out, trying to address some of those aspects on, again, food security, right to land access, except, corporate control, some of these other socio-political, economic kind of aspects. That's the part I think that is very different between these two schools of thought. And again, I mentioned there around the 90s, we kind of had this social movement arm of agroecology, really was particularly gained traction, where we had things around that time of the Battle of Seattle, if you remember this one. There was a lot of protests in Seattle around globalization, world trade aspects, corporate control, like seed, again, these aspects of seed access, seed sovereignty, food sovereignty, all of this. So you have this stronger political aspect that kind of really emerged there in terms of addressing, well, how can we change food systems? How can we farm better? How can we do better at the field level if we are not also working up through the layers of that food system and addressing some of those institutional, governmental type barriers that, of course, trickle down and impact what we do down at the field level. So I think as a general notion here, regenerative agriculture has not really yet fully embraced its political activism, we could say. It's still somewhat politically agnostic. It's a agnostic farming system. It is focused a little bit more about the growing aspects, that field level aspects, less about some of those higher level considerations. And I think that, again, where agroecology has a real strength here is that it's going beyond the farm aspects, that field level, and bringing in some of the greater, wider points around the community, the social, and again, onwards up into that food system. So I think that regenerative is still yet to fully go there. But we are seeing examples of this. Now, what about in the literature, from the academic kind of angle? You could also say that one of the differences between the two is that agroecology is certainly a lot more academic, whereas regenerative, I would say at the moment, is a lot more field-based or practitioner-driven. It has more of that bottom-up, that grassroots, that groundswell, farmer-to-farmer movement about it. It's much more of a grassroots movement that we see from regenerative. But in agroecology, it has many aspects of that also, but it has this stronger prevalence in a lot of the academic literature. And here's just a small example of this. Systemic literature review, recovering 645 articles that are exploring either regenerative or agroecology. Of that 645 articles, there were 29 that used the words regenerative agriculture. There were 616 that used the word agroecology. So agroecology is a much more widely studied school of thought, study paradigm. You'll find it much more prevalent in the literature in terms of discussing it and how to use it as a tool for food system change. And just carrying on this line of research angle for a second, this is a really interesting quote from Jonathan Lundgren. Some of you may know he's an entomologist from the US in South Dakota there. He's also a farmer, and he's doing great research, applied research into regenerative agriculture. He has a great project called 1000 Farms, where they're on farms, they're studying, who are applying these principles, who are studying the benefits, the changes, the outcomes that come from these regeneratively managed systems. So if you ever get the chance, look him up. He's also a great speaker on soil health and regenerative agriculture. If I can just read this quote of his: "I just ran a Google Scholar search of published science using the term regenerative agriculture. Of the first 100 search results, only 6 actually were measuring things on regen farms, 3 of which were his own. Review articles are not helping the movement. Science is falling down on the job." What he's saying here is that we're talking about the difference between primary research and secondary research. Of 100 articles that are coming up that are talking about regenerative agriculture, all these papers just beginning to talk about it, beginning this discussion of regen in the literature, because this is often one of the pushbacks and criticisms about regenerative. Well, where's the evidence? Where's the literature to support these ideas? You make big claims about what it can do. Well, where's the evidence? And look, rightly so, we do need evidence-based approaches as we meander through these transitions. But what he's pointing out here is that there's a lot of academic articles coming out on regenerative agriculture, which are just review papers. They're not actually going and doing primary research on regenerative farms and measuring the changes and the benefits, etc. And this is something very important that we need to be doing. It's not just about reviewing other aspects. And the example I give you of this one is, and again, not to critique this author or this academic, I think he's actually very good and writes really good papers, but here's one example here, Regenerative Agriculture and Agronomic Perspective. This is a quite highly quoted paper in the literature about regenerative agriculture. And again, it's a bit of a critical analysis about regenerative. It's a very valuable paper. It helps to kind of advance the discussion. But he's also, fair enough, critical about the lack of evidence. But I was watching this webinar with him in it from Table Debates, who some of you may know. They're an organization here in the UK. And he, quote unquote, in this webinar says, "I can honestly say I have never had a discussion specifically with a farmer about regenerative agriculture." Here's an author that has a highly quoted paper on regenerative agriculture who has never spoken to a farmer about regenerative agriculture. Therefore, I assume he's maybe never been onto a regenerative farm, yet writing papers about it and being highly quoted. Because what you can do with a review paper is say, well, I just want to go and review no-till agriculture because that's a part of regenerative agriculture. I'm going to go and review cover crops because that's a part of regenerative agriculture, etc., etc. So yes, we could go do reviews and research and look at what other people have done with cover crops or no-till or livestock integration. But is those things individually, are they regenerative agriculture? The point of those practices, those principles, is to integrate them all together into a systems approach. It's not about one little piece or the other. It's about the system. And when we integrate the system, that's when it functions. All of those pieces of the system. It's not one thing. Okay, regenerative agriculture is not just one. It's not just no-till. It's all of these things coming together into a systems-based approach. And this is that point. Is regenerative no-till? Is it keeping the soil covered? Is it integrating livestock? Is it using cover crops? Well, it's not one of those things, but it's all of those things. And this is that idea of those soil health principles, regenerative principles, is that when you apply them all, like a pinwheel is going to catch this lovely breeze that we have this year compared to last year, when you have 5 hands in function, 5 fingers functioning, 5 strategies in functioning, the systems approach, it's going to catch more wind, it's going to spin more. And this is also the point about regenerative systems. We can't review them and say, well, I'm going to go and review the literature on no-till, I'm going to review the literature on cover crops. Yeah, that's all good. And not to undermine that, it's still very valuable information. But it is not primary research that's looking at that systems approach. And this is sorely lacking in the regenerative school of thought in this movement. But again, I would just emphasize, it's still a young movement, in my opinion. We still have time to do all this important research. Yes, evidence may be a little thin on the ground, but the practitioner-based evidence, I think, is very strong. What farmers are doing at the field level is strong. Knowledge transfer, learning, experiential learning, sharing that knowledge with other farmers, learning from other farmers and growers. That part, that bottom-up part, as again we're here today, is really, really strong. And that's also a really important piece of the puzzle. We could argue more important piece of the puzzle. But of course, we want to find a marriage between ultimately literature and practice, science and practice. It's somewhere in the middle is where we also need to find a nice middle ground. So, okay, I think regenerative agriculture is still emerging. I think it still has time for its definition. I think it still has time for some of the evidence and the literature to come. And to Jonathan Lundgren's point, I think that review papers maybe are not the best way to do that. We need to get out there with some primary research. Okay, so let's move towards our final section here, towards our wrap-up, and then we can have a little bit of discussion. So transition. How do we transition our farming and food systems using these two schools of thought? Where can they both be complementary? How can we learn from them to support this process? And we have a lot of debate about transitioning, about kind of small incremental change, just kind of tweaking the current system, versus what might be called transformational change, just making deep and systemic radical change very quickly, so full system change very quickly, versus incremental change, just nudging the current system, tweaking this, working around the outskirts, working around the outsides there and just tweaking. And we have this debate, evolution or revolution. We don't have time to make small changes. We got to make big changes now. There's this kind of debate. But, big changes can be scary and it's hard. Some people are paralyzed by big change. Sometimes it's easier to take small steps towards that change. I don't think that that's bad either, but I agree we do need to think about changing at a transformational level quickly. But if that becomes paralyzing and therefore we get paralyzed into inaction, that's not useful either. So I think there's scope for both, again, trying to maybe find a little bit of this middle ground. So in this context, could we be thinking about integrating some of those practices? It could be the soil health, regenerative, agroecological practices. Can we begin to integrate those into the production systems immediately in the short term, whilst we do this deeper systemic transition towards overall regenerative systems, agroecological systems, more at that bigger, wider kind of landscape scale? And a really nice example of this, of course, is the light bulb, Edison and the light bulb. If we think about going from the candle there to the light bulb, it wasn't incremental change that got us from the candle. We weren't tweaking that candle, improving it to turn it into a light bulb. That's not what happened. It was a complete rethinking of the candle. Let's just redesign. Let's just completely redo it, do something different. And that's a really nice example of the power of transformative change and how it can supersede a previous paradigm with something better, with an alternative, with a replacement. And that's the power of transformative change. I think we can all agree that would be great. There's a really nice example. But once we got the light bulb, what's happened since? We've actually gone through more of this incremental change. Now we've been tweaking the light bulb, tweaking, improving the efficiency, etc. That's not bad. There's nothing wrong with that either. It's great that we've gone from now to much higher efficiency bulbs and lower wattage and etc. There's nothing wrong with incremental change. It's been really valuable in the world of the light bulb. But transformational change has also been really valuable in the creation of that light bulb. So I think it's a nice example or analogy of maybe why we do need both, and maybe there's room for both. But I think we can all appreciate the importance of some of that transformational change in terms of quicker acting. So in this context of thinking about transition, how do we transition our farming systems towards a better option? I'm a big fan of this particular framework called the ESR framework, Efficiency, Substitution, Redesign. And this was kind of first coined by a Canadian-Australian, or he lives in Australia now, academic, Stuart B. Hill. He's a great deep thinker, really interesting guy if you're not familiar with him. And he kind of put together this kind of idea of saying, well, we have this resource-intensive, high-input farming systems. How are we going to wean them off? How are we going to transition those? And I like this framework that kind of approaches this. It says, okay, well, first of all, we need to start by being as efficient as we can. So all of the things we are using, be that fertilizers, pesticides, etc., we want to use as least amount of these as possible. So we want to be hyper efficient. We want to use less and less of these materials that we're trying to wean ourselves off. And so that becomes then a really core focus on high efficiency. How do we get maximum bang for buck, use less and get more? And there's many techniques. I'll give a quick example of how we can apply some of this thinking to just be ultra hyper efficient. Once we do that, when we're hyper efficient like that, it means we're using really small amounts of these things. And that means the jump to then drop them is not so scary because we're only using such small amounts. When we are deeply dependent on high inputs, it does feel like a big jump to drop them out. So if we go through this high efficiency phase, dial them down, then the jump to cutting them out is only a small jump. And so this then becomes this idea of a substitution. Now we're going to take those inputs that we're trying to wean ourselves off and we're going to substitute them with another, with something else, with a softer option, with a more sustainable, with a more ecologically minded, organic, natural type replacement. Okay, so then we're into this substitution phase. And once we do that, really, the substitution phase is really harnessing a lot of, again, biological type processes, ecosystem type processes, in that which then the jump to then cut some of those out or drop them is also not so big, where we can use this third principle of redesign. And redesign means redesigning the farm system in a way that mimics nature, landscapes, that harnesses ecological processes, ecosystem services, and harnesses them in towards food producing in a way that we try to mimic the way in which natural landscapes function and produce food, calories, etc., as it is now. So this is this kind of school of thought that says it can help us navigate this pathway of transition. And just to be clear, it's not to say that it works exactly linearly in 1, 2, 3, where we start with efficiency, we stop into substitution, we stop into redesign. It's a blurred line. You can be doing all three of these things at the same time, but it's just a way to think about and conceptualize how to navigate that difficult process of uncoupling ourselves on those dependencies. And it's the redesign element, when we redesign our farming systems in nature's image, so to speak. And again, this is this overlapping part with agroecology, taking the science of ecology and bringing it into an agricultural context. How can we learn from ecological systems and apply that into a productive goal, into a productive system? It is this redesign piece that is particularly important, that has much greater potential for change. And this is kind of just an example of this, where, okay, look, it's all good to be efficient and to substitute out of these things, but what if we substitute out, we dial these things down and we substitute into, let's say, natural or biological alternatives? Well, farmers can still be economically dependent on those. They may be softer options, better for the environment, but it's still purchased inputs. And that's not also economically as sustainable either. So when we redesign and use plants and natural processes to redesign the farm system, this is, again, where we have much greater impact towards that transition goal, because we are using the natural processes in order to help fuel that productive system. So let me give you an example of this in case that was a little too fluffy for you. Like, let's use an example of nitrogen. Nitrogen fertilizer, hugely dependent agriculture at the moment, also causing a lot of ecological problems in terms of nitrate leaching into waterways, nitrogen off-gassing into the air as nitrous oxides or ammonia, etc. So there's a lot of environmental degradation that's coming from leaky and excessive nitrogen. So that's one of the things that would be great if we could use less and less and reduce our dependency on those. So as an example, we can still, in this efficiency phase, you're still going to be using the nitrogen. You're still using some fertilizer, but you're going to be using it in a hyper-efficient way. So liquefying it, foliar applying it directly onto plants, for example, as compared to putting it down into the soil where it is then leaky, where those reactions of nitrogen off-gassing into the atmosphere occur. All of those losses primarily occur from the soil. So if we can bypass that and deliver that nutrient straight into the plant, we can use less, but still get that impact. So strategies like that, or split applications, okay, splitting it out, small doses, spoon feeding, or stabilizing some of those nitrogen inputs with things like other carbon additives. And there's a whole range of, we won't get into the practical aspects of these for this audience, but combining carbon sources which are like a sponge, and they bind to that nitrogen and stabilize it, slow some of the losses, slow some of that leaky nature of nitrogen. So again, these are still using nitrogen, but we're just going to use it in smarter ways in which we optimize the uptake and reduce some of the negatives and the losses. So we might do that for a period of years, and again, it depends on the transition time frame here, and it's different in every different context. But at some point, you're going to be using less and less nitrogen, that you may be able to say, okay, I feel more comfortable about dropping it now, and I might substitute with an alternative. So what would an alternative be? Well, it could be organic forms of nitrogen. There are many nitrogen forms which are organic and therefore much more stable. They are less leaky in the system. So they are softer, better options. or we could use things like nitrogen fixing bacteria as an example. So we are substituting now with organisms, a biological inoculant that will provide that same nitrogen to the plant through a biological process of N fixation. Okay, so we're still using inputs. We still have a bit of dependency here. We're still buying these natural biological type inputs, but they're better for the environment. They're less softer, they're not so leaky, etc. And then the final step then would be to redesign our farming system and diversify with a whole lot more legumes, for example. Bring legumes into the system so that they provide that nitrogen fixation. Let's bring better crop rotations to harness the supply and utilization of that nitrogen that comes in through the course of that rotation. Bringing livestock in, better grazing management, use of manures. So using livestock to cycle nitrogen and also to provide some of that nitrogen through the manure. Okay, so it's really saying, how do we make a farming system that's like nature, where we have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria functioning, where we have animals integrated, grazing, depositing, cycling nutrients, etc. So this is kind of a practical example, just to give you on that kind of theoretical process of the efficiency, substitution, redesign. Now, that again, as you can see, is very field-based. That's very field-level change. And we still haven't addressed maybe some of these barriers further up into the food system. And this is, I think, where, again, agroecology does a much better job at trying to address this, whereas regenerative is still predominantly focused at the field level. And again, I know there are examples out there of this beginning to change, but I think this is where agroecology has a lot of strength about it, where regenerative could learn a lot from this. And here we're talking about then that difference between incremental and transformational change. So at the bottom here, level 1, 2, and 3, you can see things like some of those field level agricultural elements or principles there, the diversity, synergies, resilience, recycling, being efficient. These are all really important things that field level. But when we move up into level 4 and 5, the agroecological literature outlines that it's addressing these food system challenges is what's going to provide a much more effective leverage for this transition, for this change. So what am I talking about here? For example, level 4, establishing the connections between growers and eaters, developing alternative food networks. So it's this better marriage. This is, again, more of a social cultural aspect, a better marriage between producer and consumer. And of course, we have a lot of examples of that with food markets and that kind of thing kind of happening, direct marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, there's one layer, and then another layer beyond this, rebuilding the global food system so that it is sustainable and equitable for all. And so over on the right-hand side, you can see that some of those agroecological principles now are more of these community-based ones, the social human aspects. It's less about the field level technique. It's about sharing knowledge, respecting cultures, circular economies, good governance, some of the human and social cultural values. It is these other aspects that are really important to connect and address the food system changes, which again, I make that comment there that regenerative, I think, could still really learn from. But I think one big part of the literature of agroecology also talks about, and it's under that heading there of co-creation of knowledge, is this point that farmer-to-farmer learning, peer-to-peer learning, knowledge exchange is absolutely key. This bottom-up approach is absolutely key in this discussion. And farmers coming together in a field and talking, sharing knowledge, showing what they do, and advancing the field-based practices is, yes, really, really important. But there's another aspect to this, which is also in terms of collaborating, working together, sharing seeds. It's not just about sharing knowledge, so to speak. It could be sharing resources, working as co-ops, working as communities. It is so much of this, again, that cultural, social aspects to this that is also a really important part of the transition. And that's really what this event here is also very much all about. It is this farmer-driven, bottom-up place where we can come together, where we can talk, where we can exchange ideas and share knowledge. And this is really, really important from the ground level, field-based aspects. But as you can see from this event, that has grown from its first year, where there was 450 farmers in a couple of barns over the other side of the farm there, into this thing that it is today, where there are, I think there was 8,000 or so people last year. I'm not sure what the numbers are this year. I mean, there's thousands of us here now. And it's not just farmers. There's a whole bunch of different people now that come to this event. It's, plenty of rural folks, but there's now all these urban folks that come along to this event. We're having broader discussions about food systems, about food quality, about health, about all of these other topics that are not just farming or not just soil health. So you can see that this space has created, this event particularly is so unique. There's nothing like this event anywhere else in the world. It is such a wonderful place to come and share and be present. And I'm sure you all enjoy it. That's why you're here. And I can say that I certainly also enjoy it, speaking here and also participating here. It is this space for this co-creation, for this knowledge sharing that does also extend beyond just the farm-based field level soil health strategies. The very fact that you're all here talking about there's 10 stages here, and there's like how many 100 different speakers and all these other different topics. The very fact that all of that is happening is kind of testament to the importance of this bottom-up, not kind of top-down approach, but this groundswell that's been really important in driving this change. So let's wrap this up into some final statements, and then we can have a quick discussion. We also have this point about buzzwords, and we don't like buzzwords. Things that are trending, things that are just a buzzword for now. Oh, they'll be gone later on. We'll moved on to the next term. We talk about this in many different aspects, many different contexts. And if I could just kind of bring a bit of an analogy or an example to this discussion. This term of soil health, I mentioned this earlier. Soil health, in my view, has been a key thing that really broke down that barrier between what was conventional and organic. All of a sudden, we had the same vocabulary to talk about soils, and we came together and asked similar types of questions. There's a really great thing that happened. And if you think about soil health, actually, soil health you could consider as a bit of a buzzword. Previously, it used to be called soil quality. And previously to that, it used to be called soil fertility. If you look at a lot of the agricultural books at the turn of the century, kind of pre-war type times, it was all about soil fertility farming, about using plants, legumes, rotations, livestock to lift fertility, to improve the fertility of the soil. That was the term that was the buzzword, was the norm that everyone understood and could get that relevant context and work with. And that was a great term, and it did its job. Over time, like all words, come and go, it turned a bit into soil quality. And soil quality perhaps was a little bit more of an academic word, used a bit more in the academic literature, but it was also just an evolution of soil fertility. Soil fertility could be grounded a little bit more in soil chemistry or the nutrients in the soil, whereas soil quality opened that up to consider maybe some of the other aspects to soil, maybe the soil physical structure, how well it's aggregated, for example. And that also fell out of favor, and we have this term soil health. And I think soil health probably brings in a bit more of the soil biology, the living aspects to soil. And now we have this term that's integrating maybe a bit more of a comprehensive view of soils. That's just a natural process of words coming and going, our dialogue changing with time. It happens. It happens in 100 other contexts that you could think of. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we have a term that is currently bringing us together. We use that word buzzword. Buzzword has that negative connotation to it, but it's actually a word that we all come together, that we can all talk about, a common language that we can all use and advance these kind of discussions. So I'm a big fan of soil health. I think it's great. Sure, it's now also really overused, and you can't open an agricultural magazine without seeing something about soil health this, soil health that, and a soil health event, etc., etc. Wow. And Okay, yes, it's a bit overused. Yeah, fine. But I think that's for a reason. It's capturing the imagination of the audience, of the time right now. And that's great. It's, again, bringing us together. And I think regenerative is the same. Sustainability has fallen out of favor, as we mentioned. And which way is the wind blowing? If I stand here, maybe it will, if I put my back to you all, it'll block the wind. Yes, sustainability has fallen out of favor. Like I said, I don't totally discount it. I think it still has an important, there are pieces of that are still very important and relevant, just like soil fertility, just like soil quality, but it is being integrated into, perhaps a new, more modern terminology. And so for me, yes, regenerative is a buzzword, but it is also a word, a topic that we are all, again, coalescing around, coming together around, and having these important conversations and dialogues. And sure, regenerative is ill-defined, and therefore that creates difficulties in pinning it down and different people using it to mean different things. Of course, there are all of those challenges. And one of those that keeps getting flagged is the greenwashing of this term. Corporates using regenerative under all sorts of promotional material and et cetera these days. But are they really regenerative? Are they actually regenerating the land, the resources, et cetera? Or is it, just an element of this greenwashing? Of course, we have those challenges, those difficulties. And yes, that's a real problem. And yes, we do need to navigate that. But it's not like greenwashing is unique to regenerative. I mean, greenwashing has been around forever. It was sustainable was also being greenwashed previously. I'm not sure why we always flag this point that, there's all this greenwashing happening with regenerative. Greenwashing just happens. It happens in all sorts of other contexts. And we just need to navigate that. That's not a unique problem to this regenerative movement. It's just something we need to navigate, like always. So for me, look, I'm into the buzzwords. If it means we are coming together, if it means we're breaking down barriers, if it means we're opening dialogue and we are moving the needle, taking the conversation forward from there, I think it's a great thing. And in that regard, I think that the time is now. It is this movement, it is this moment, and I think this event particularly, again, is testament to that, is the opportunity that we have for regenerative agriculture. The time is now to have these conversations. The time is now to advance this movement. And again, it's about the people and the connection. It's the community aspects, the social community aspects that are so, so important to this. And again, this is why this particular event has been so successful, and it's so great at putting on an evening social for us all where we have the space to have these conversations. And I think that's what's very, very, so very special and important about this movement. And through those social conversations, we can do a lot of rethinking. Okay, we've got to think about agriculture, farming, and food systems in a different way. We need creative thoughts. We need some new ideas. And that's what regenerative agriculture is bringing, is new ideas. And yes, it's ill-defined. And yes, it's still maturing. And yes, it has those challenges, but that's okay. Just look at agroecology. It's been floating around since the 1920s. And it has gone through those iterations and evolutions. So I think we need to open our minds for regenerative to go through that process. We don't have to lock all of this in. It's about coming together, having those conversations, bouncing around some new ideas, finding some good creativity to help us really approach this transition and how we're going to move forward. Okay, so I will close with this last slide here. If I can just read this quote from this paper, aptly titled A Leap of Faith here. But I think they just summarize some of the really nice discussions, this kind of broader overview that I've kind of meandered through today. It kind of crystallizes some of these ideas really nicely. If I can just read this for you all. Regenerative agriculture is emerging as one alternative model for agricultural production. However, it has not matured sufficiently for a clear definition to have emerged or for the claimed benefits to be rigorously tested. Thus, numerous competing discourses have emerged around what regenerative agriculture is, its potential role in the future of farming, leading to this level of contention about its value. As it continues to grow as a movement, as a worldview, as a farming approach, understanding the differences in thinking and worldview of those various proponents will be important for better understanding the goals of regenerative agriculture, how to reach them, and how to measure their impact and improve the communication around this movement. This is important to avoid and resolve unnecessary or destructive tensions between the range of agricultural sustainability discourses. So I think in summary, it's really this point that I think it is still emerging and we still need to give it time, and the best place to engage and give it that time is this peer-to-peer knowledge exchange type events like this, and processes and other similar ones, field days and small things and big things. It doesn't have to be big. It can be those small 10 farmers sitting in a circle in the middle of a field. It's about creating that space for those conversations to go. And of course, we watch with great interest as it unfolds. Okay, so we got there to in the end. Where's our roving mic man? Is there any question? Oh, there he is. Is there any questions? Maybe you're all sick of my voice. Or comments. We have a couple over on this side.
Joel, just a comment. Is regenerative...
What's that? You don't know what? On this one? There's something's wrong with the mic. Yeah, tech. Can you just yell out, or do you want to come and use this one?
I can try. I'm loud.
Go for it.
Is it, though, beauty of regenerative agriculture, what you talked about there? It's a bottom-up level. Science is coming to this a bit late. They're following on. But is there always an inherent danger once science or academia gets their hands on it, the method of it become just another system? Are we not better off keep regenerative farm level and keep academia out of culture, right?
Okay, I'll try and repeat the question. The question was really, isn't the real benefit of regenerative the fact that it is bottom up and ground up, and where academics perhaps get involved is where things get complicated and messy and unproductive. And so would it not be better to keep regenerative separate from academia, to keep it farmer-led, farmer-driven, and bottom-up, is in essence the comment in question. And look, yeah, sure, it's a fair comment. You, as you kind of stated in your question, yes, academia has been late to the game. It's now trying to catch up with this movement in terms of what farmers are finding in the field, sharing and driving the change. So yes, that's its real strength. It is a real strength of this movement. It's why it has emerged the way in which it has. And look, I take the point, absolutely. It's a key point of its benefit. I guess why should we not keep it separate, and why do we need some level of evidence-based integration, is that reality that if we want it to really grow into something that is the mainstream, we do need an evidence-based approach to that. Some institutional organizations, they need that evidence base. They're not going to when we talk about shifting and changing institutions, they're big behemoths, and so it takes time to change huge organizations, institutions like that. And so they're not going to do that on a whim. So we do need, perhaps we could argue, a bit of a decent evidence base to help then drive that deeper institutional food system level change to make regenerative the mainstream. I think your point is absolutely on point, though. You're right. Maybe we need to be mindful and careful of it not being co-opted through that, as your point is. But perhaps maybe there's got to be a middle ground. The fact that this has started ground up is key. Let's keep that going, but let's try and add some evidence to that as we go along. Middle ground, perhaps. Yeah. Good question, though. Now, there was another lady at the back there. You're going to have to shout. Is it? Unless you're happy to quickly come up and... which is probably what you don't want to do. But you seem like you've dropped something there, but you dropped your hat, I think.
Okay, I was shouting at 100 people this morning at 7:30 to straighten their legs more, so this is fine. So I'm coming at it from an agroecological point of view as well as a regenerative point of view as a farmer, but also as a political activist in the food system. So I really kind of think that regenerative agroecology or agroecological regenerative farming, it's all kind of the same thing, and this division that we're putting between the academic and the practitioners is kind of a false division, really. And I think that's another thing we need to get over, the whole them and us, like you were talking about, because agroecology is from the bottom up as well. It's the grassroots farmers and the people who eat the food who are the same people. So I think it's good to have the definitions of all the terms, but in terms of, rather than saying this is us, those are these people, we're all doing practicing and researching at the same time. And there was something around the whole greenwashing idea, which I agree with we need to resist. But at the same time, the fact that we even do greenwashing, or somebody's doing greenwashing, is saying, oh, people want things to be greener now. And so 30 years ago when a lot of us started this farming, nobody was doing greenwashing because they didn't think there was a market for it. So I think in a way now we're kind of like, we've won the argument. So even if people are pretending to be green, at least they know that's what sells stuff. So.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, great comments. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to jump up then? There's maybe one more here, and then we can.
It's a bit of a long question. Regen Ag and the production of food, skeptics say, is just a flavour of the month. This is just what it's all about, surely. It's the taste. Andy Cato advocates the taste of the bread from Regen Ag wild farm bread. It may not be sourdough, but it's a game changer to get supermarkets to stock better, nutritious food. How else do we get Regen Ag produce food recognised and monitorised?
It's tapping into this little discussion around some of these differences where if you look at agroecology, generally it has more so tried to bypass the middleman and connect more directly farmer to consumer. One difference, I could have had this in our divergence kind of section here, is that regenerative agriculture is much more so engaging with the middleman who agroecology tries to bypass. So in your example there is a perfect one. It is, look at the corporates now, the food processors who are getting into regenerative now. Okay, if we want to change the mainstream, there's that argument that says, well, we need to change the big players. They need to be on board with this if that's what we're trying to do, if we're trying to make it mainstream. And so regenerative brands may be engaging more into that corporate world or into the supermarkets, trying to change the mainstream through that way. And that's, on some level, some might criticize that, but equally we could also, and I get that, but equally we could also say that agroecology has been around for a long time, and has it really burst through into the mainstream? We could also argue it's remained a little bit on the fringe, a little bit on the outskirts, and that could also be its weakness. Why has it been around for such a long time and hasn't fully created this deep transformational change? Regenerative, which I agree with your comment there, is there's a whole lot of overlap between all of these schools of thought, but your example is that regenerative is engaging in the mainstream, is trying to change that mainstream, and maybe that's a better approach. But we, again, have this difficulty around the greenwashing discussion. But yeah, the lady's comment there, I think, is also valid. It's maybe a sign that that's what people want, and hopefully that's going to nudge those greenwashers to ultimately change as well. So look, I think there's just a philosophical debate there around, do we bypass or do we change the behemoth? And I think that there's probably scope for both. But yeah, I think you're right. If we really want people to access this, if we want it to become the norm, we do need everyone on board. That's why it needs to become the norm. That means it's everyone. So, yeah. Okay, so that concludes this session, and we went a little bit over with the questions. So we'll be starting again at 3:45 is the next session with a practical case study on farmers helping farmers, peer-to-peer learning, all the way from Australia. So that'll be on in 3:45 if you'd like to hear a practical example of how we are driving the change from another example of that from the bottom up. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you a bit later. Thank you.